It's a pleasure to be able to introduce the plenary. But before I do that, I wanted to take a brief moment to acknowledge a number of people by name. These are people who were central to kind of putting all this on, and it's a lot, as you can see. So Rebecca Lurie, first of all, Michael Menser from Brooklyn College, James D. Philippus at Rutgers University, Evan Casper Futterman at Bronx Cooperative Development, Carmen Huertas-Noble at the CUNY School of Law, who should be up here, Catherine Mulder and Jessica Gordon-Nembart from the CUNY John Jay, thank you. James Mandelberg from Hunter, and last but not least, Michael Lalonde, Samantha Valente, and Paula Finn. Thank you. So as you know, kind of the representative from CUNY Urban Studies, I thought I'd just say a couple things about why I think, or why I'm so excited about this and about this panel. One of the things that I think is most exciting about today's conference is that it is happening here at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. I'm excited because in many ways it fits well with what I see as the kind of broader intellectual and political project at the core of SLU. That project is one that refuses to see the struggles in the workplace and over working conditions as somehow separate or distinct from struggles that have come to define our cities, whether it is over housing, as we heard before, food security, transportation, or the political process itself. Neoliberal capitalism undermines democracy at work and the democratic public sphere writ large. So during the week and in the evenings when we hold classes here, and you can come see for yourself, you will see labor studies students who are learning about the history of the labor movement and organized labor, rubbing elbows with urban studies students who are learning about rent strikes, housing struggles, and public policy. And the hope, at least I think, is that if these students rub elbows enough, and if they begin to see the connections between struggles, we can create a generation of students eager to fight injustice wherever it rears its head. Given this, I think the promise of this conference is very clear. It allows us to talk about what is at stake in those fights and what exactly we should be fighting for, namely a more cooperative and more democratic economy. In addition to speaking to the goals of the SLU, this conference is also an attempt to tap the energy of a growing movement of people who, in their eagerness to rethink our economy, are engaged in building new types of organizations and forms of solidarity, whether it is building worker cooperatives or developing community land trusts or designing new ways of financing such projects. We find people and individuals doing new types of work that's really important. This semester, both Michael Menser and Evan Casper Futterman have been teaching a course here on precisely these issues. And this summer, Rebecca Lurie, who is just up here, will be teaching 2 courses on the topic. So come back. Of course, and as you can read in the front cover of your programs, this is also an urban studies conference. So this poses a thorny question. What does any of this have to do with cities or how we live in them? So I think part of the answer will come from this plenary. And so I'm very excited to announce or to introduce our speakers. First, we will hear from Dr. Sheila Foster. Dr. Foster is a professor of law and public policy at Georgetown University. She is also chair of the advisory committee of the Global Parliament of Mayors, a member of the Aspen Institute's Urban Innovation Working Group, and an advisory board member of the Marin Institute for Urban Management at NYU. She has a forthcoming book, or is it forthcoming book with MIT Press on the Co-City, which builds on her work on the urban commons. Next, we will hear from Roger Green. Roger Green is the founder of Citizen Share Brooklyn and Society for Effective Economic Democracy, or SEED. SEED, which was inspired by the grassroots efforts to save Interfaith Medical Center, a multi-site community health care center. In 2004, and as part of that campaign, Green became a co-chair of the Coalition to Transform and Save Interfaith Medical Center. Between 1981 and 2006, Green also served as a member of the New York State Assembly representing the 57th District. Lastly, the plenary will be moderated by Carmen Huertas-Noble, who was also on the organizing team for this. Dr. Huertas-Noble was part of the organizing, is the founding director of the Community and Economic Development Clinic. Her research focuses on promoting alternative ownership models, including community land trust and worker-owned cooperatives. So please join me in welcoming the panel.
Thank you. This is a great group, and I want to say thank you to Sheila Foster and Roger Green. It's an honor to be on the panel with you. Basically, I teach the Community and Economic Development Clinic at CUNY School of Law. We have an economic democracy docket, and really believe that collective ownership is needed, both in terms of the commons and also in terms of ownership over your labor and the benefits of your labor. So I'm going to let these two scholars share about their work, and then I'm going to ask them some questions to engage in dialogue, and then we're going to open it up to the audience.
Okay, thank you. It's great to be here and to see so many people who believe in a new economy. I wanted to talk a bit about something I've been thinking about for about at least 15 years, and that is the idea of the commons and how the commons relates to not just things out there in the natural resources outside of the places where we live, but in fact is really about how we live and who gets to control and own the places where we live and many of the assets in the city. So I want to start with this idea that the city itself is a commons or a common good, and that's an idea that I've been developing over some time. But let me start with the story. In 2016, the New York City Comptroller released an audit of city-owned land, revealing that the city owns over 1,400 vacant properties spread throughout the 5 boroughs. And some of these properties have been vacant for about 50 years or more. Because New York City is in the midst of a housing affordability crisis, the comptroller's audit suggested that the city could establish a land bank in which to place this property with the promise to develop up to 57,000 units of permanently affordable housing on these lots, and perhaps a smaller subset of privately owned properties that were also becoming vacant, were behind on their property taxes, that the city could foreclose upon those and add those. So far, so good in my view. There's a dire need for affordable housing. Using public land to meet that need seems to be a great idea. However, in a press conference announcing the results of the audit and the plan to establish the land bank, the comptroller said the following, quote, "When the city owns property, we get to call the shots about how land is developed and for whom, which is why these properties are so valuable." So on the one hand, I'm a property law scholar. This is a pretty straightforward statement of property ownership. An owner of property is said to hold all the legal entitlements, what we call the sticks in the bundle of property rights, including the right of possession, the right of control, the right of exclusion, the right to enjoy, the right to transfer the land. On the other hand, it really begs the question for me why the state, here the local government, should behave as if it were a private property owner, exercising unfettered discretion over city land and public assets. In other words, it's not at all clear to me as a matter of law or policy that the character of this so-called public property, this vacant land that's no longer private, that's fallen out of private hands back into the public hands, why this should operate functionally the same as private property. And there are 2 reasons this seems questionable to me. First, decisions about how to develop that land, what to do with public land, are not always made, I think it's obvious to this group, in the public interest, right? But rather on the basis of what we would call a utilitarian calculus of individual decision makers. In other words, well-organized interest groups have easy access to local decision makers, and can easily obtain what we call net transfers in the forms of tax breaks and other subsidies from these public decision makers. And we've just seen an example of this and the tensions it raises in the Amazon headquarter competition and its recent pullout of New York City, after some public officials and community members pushed back against the billions of dollars in tax breaks it would receive upon building a second headquarters in Queens. The second reason this seems odd to me, this statement by the comptroller, is that it raises the specter of selling public land to the highest private bidder, particularly in an era of widespread economic inequality. In other words, taken at face value and to its extreme, this declaration by the comptroller that we own the land and we get to do with it what we want, and that's why it's so valuable to us, means that the city could decide not to build affordable housing on the land, but to sell off the parcels to the highest bidder, much like a private property owner would do. Its statement suggests that. So I frequently refer to sociologist Saskia Sassen's provocative essay in which she wrote, "Who owns the city?" in an era of corporatizing access and control over urban land and corporate buying of whole pieces of cities, which she says is transforming the small and public into the large and private across many cities around the world. Sassen details a post-2008 pattern in many cities around the world of large corporate entities acquiring whole blocks of underutilized or dead land for development of high-end luxury commercial and residential space. And she says that this large-scale privatization of land in cities has an effect, oddly, of de-urbanizing city space, and in fact creating de facto gated spaces with lots of people. You might think of the Hudson Yards. Although provocatively framed, her question, I think, arises out of a concern that public institutions are commodifying and privatizing our collective resources in cities, our commons, ranging from open spaces, parks, underutilized or abandoned lands and buildings, streets and roads, to digital infrastructures and networks. So consequently, the scale of these spaces that are accessible to the public is shrinking, and the population of those displaced from cities is expanding. So I've argued in my work that we should think of this land and these assets and the infrastructure of the city itself as a common pool resource, or as a commons. Some of you may have read the famous book by William Cronin and his groundbreaking history of how Chicago developed in the 19th century. And he reminds us that before the city, there was the land. His wonderful account describes how Chicago was formed out of an urban landscape, or out of a barren landscape, by people who came there and created the urban landscape through cultural and economic exchanges. This is resonance for those scholars that know of John Locke's treatise on government, in which he famously wrote, "God gave the world to men in common, and that whatever is taken from the state of nature through a person's labor to make it his or her own has a property right in it." But in a less celebrated portion of Locke's work, he also said that where there's surplus property, it should revert to being in the commons. He said that whoever takes from the state of nature or commons through labor is theirs. However, whatever is beyond this is more than his share and belongs to other. And so in other words, we shouldn't be able to claim more than we can utilize. Whatever remains idle goes back. So thinking of this land, vacant, abandoned land, the infrastructure of the city, as a commons is a way to stake a claim to the city. Its streets, its land, its buildings that are no longer in private hands, as well as to claim the right to be part of the creation and recreation of the city, to shape decisions about collective resources in which we all have a stake. Thinking of the city as a commons is a way to acknowledge that the city is generative and that its resources should be accessible to even and especially those without resources. So urban residents and many local communities here and around the world increasingly view this vacant land abandoned homes, factories, strip malls, and other structures as opportunities for productive reuse to stabilize and even revitalize their communities. They reimagine these assets as urban farms, community gardens, community centers, childcare facilities, artistic spaces. Empty homes can be renovated and reoccupied. We've introduced the framework of the Co-City, a new urban governance model rooted in the conceptual pillars of the city as a commons. And this emerges out of our decades-long experimentation in cities really around the world. And now here in places like Harlem, we have a project which we're working on, a community-based broadband network that's going to be put in a trust. And now in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where we're working to revitalize an economically distressed, poor African-American part of that city. And in each of these cities, we've been experimenting with policies and institutional protocols and legal structures, land trusts among them, in which a variety of kind of civic, neighborhood, and infrastructure goods and services are co-produced and co-managed by communities with others in different forms of what we call pooling, referencing common pool resources between public actors, private actors, civic institutions, local businesses, et cetera. And public authorities play a very important role in enabling this form of pooling and the creation of collective forms of stewarding our collective resources in communities, including by putting some of public land into trust and other legal instruments in which communities can co-govern that land for affordable housing, for community space, even for local businesses, in a way that's sustainable but also kept affordable. So the city, the public authority, is an important facilitator of creating the co-city, the city, a co-governed, co-managed city in which people can use our collective resources to generate new forms of goods and services. So we've also been in a larger co-city empirical project tracking in over 100 cities around the world ways in which this is already happening, ways in which communities are doing this in various ways. It's called our co-city mapping project, again, to begin to build a toolbox of doing this. So let me end here because we only have 10 minutes, and then we'll go into Q&A. But I would say that the idea of the city as a commons is a framework, the co-city, to, again, stake a claim to collective resources, to prevent enclosure of those resources, and to deeply democratize the way in which we use those resources and manage them for sustainability and affordability. Thank you.
Thank you for those remarks, very enlightening remarks. Before I proceed, I'd like to acknowledge those folks who brought us here today. Rebecca Laurie, I see Dr. Michael Weiss. Please get his book, We Decide, one of the great, yes it is, outstanding articulation of this whole concept of really not only the commons, but participatory democracy and how it plays into our efforts to bring about the type of transformations that we need at this point in time. I see my good friend and ally, Bruce Richards, Executive Vice President, 1199, and currently serving as a senior advisor for George Gresham, the head of 1199, and Shewell Amin, who's heading up the task force within the union to look at the implementation of unionized worker cooperatives within the healthcare sector. So just wanted to acknowledge them. And of course, Carmen, Huertas-Noble, who has been an outstanding leader at CUNY. CUNY system, starting here with Murphy's and at CUNY Law at Brooklyn College, really serving as a vanguard in moving this whole dialogue forward. So, I would like to first begin my remarks by, really reflecting on my own lived experience. First, as a poor boy growing up in Brooklyn, that's what we call ourselves. We relationships and the experiences that I had as a member of the New York State Assembly, and then coming out of that experience, joining with my allies in organized labor in the community in attempting to save an institution that was dear to the community called Interfaith Medical Center, which is in the Commons, right? The healthcare sector is a key anchor within what we define as the Commons, particularly those that are public institutions and the so-called nonprofit voluntary hospitals, of which Interfaith is one of those institutions. I began this journey first when I was in the State Assembly, looking at a particular crisis that was brewing in our community, which we didn't have a children's psychiatric hospital. Many of our children were being basically deported over to other regions to secure services. And so a group of advocates organized to approach the state legislature, myself included, as I was serving as the chair of the Committee on Children and Families, to create a new institution in Brooklyn, which we did, a children's psychiatric hospital built at a cost of about $54 million, state-of-the-art institution. And you know, when I introduced the bill that was eventually enacted into law to create this institution, which now is located in Brownsville, all right? And I never forget, on the opening day, as the lights were flashing and ribbon cutting was going on, as my chief of staff, Sania Metzger, and I were leaving, I turned to the medical director and I said, "How's it going? It looks great. Is there anything else that we can do? Are there any problems?" We had built a facility that included state-of-the-art swimming pool, science labs, living rooms, cafeteria, just incredible space. And the medical director turns to me and he says, "Well, there's one problem." I said, "What? What could it be?" "The children, they don't want to go home." Think about that. The children, they don't want to go home. Across the street were abandoned buildings, failing schools, you know, high rates of unemployment, wage stagnation, low aggregation of assets to create wealth within these communities. The children, they don't want to go home. And that was my epiphany. You know, I had built many different institutions, public schools, 3 public schools that I had actually authored the laws to create within my district. This hospital, I can go on. And then I realized, I said, well, all this is good, but we have an issue of structural economic inequality that exists that we haven't addressed. The children, they don't want to go home. So that was my epiphany. And then as I began to look at this and looking at the disinvestment that was occurring as a result of neoliberal public policies, began a critical assessment of what's happening within our society as it relates to the system of capitalism as it currently is. And as I would often say, this is not a free market system. What we're looking at is a system of crony capitalism, predatory capitalism, casino capitalism, monopoly capitalism. You know, this is not the capitalism that was defined, in days of yore. So, as I was retiring from the assembly, some of my allies in organized labor, particularly 1199, the New York State Nurses Association, asked me to join up with a coalition as Interfaith Hospital was about to close. And as it was closing, I kept thinking about this experience that I had building this children's psychiatric hospital. You know, the relationship between the commons, institutions, and the healthcare sector and the larger community. There had been 15 hospitals, mostly located in communities of color, that had closed within a period of 7 years in the city of New York. St. Mary's Hospital, I can go on, among them. And this was it, you know. There was a sense that this was an existential crisis that we needed to, you know, really create a resistance movement in opposition to this particular closing. And it did occur as a result of leaders like Bruce Richards and the faith leaders within the community, academicians, the community activists, health justice advocates came together and created this organization called the Coalition to Save Interfaith Medical Center. We reached out to the previous speaker, Phil Thompson, Dr. Phil Thompson at MIT CoLab, to do a study of why interfaith was closing and its impact on the surrounding community. And basically what we found was that the hospitals had been taken over in many cases by, again, private equity firms who came in and were extracting resources in the guise of serving as efficiency experts. We then proceeded to, as MIT CoLab introduced this study, we began I guess you would call it a dialogical discourse. We sat down and looked at what was happening, a community of inquiry. Why was this occurring? And we came up with a term called social welfare colonialism, basically meaning that there are certain forces in the bureaucracy and the plutocracy who come into some communities and extract resources that were initially supposed to be for the benefit of those local communities. You know, so we defined that as social welfare colonialism. And then said, how do we move from that, you know, from this type of phenomena? So we then changed the name of the coalition from the Coalition to Save Interfaith to the Coalition to Transform. And in the process of a mission for transformation, began to look at how can the hospitals themselves begin to address the structural economic inequality that exists within these communities? If, in fact, the hospitals are supposed to be quote-unquote nonprofit, how do we change this? I'll never forget one night, one of our delegates, one of the leading delegates, a sister by the name of Harper, had she found out that the head of the hospitals at the time were contracting someone at a cost of $65,000 a month to come in and to do staffing ratios that the nurses and the frontline workers had said they would do for free. $65,000 a month, coming in from outside, from California, you name it. Anyhow, that was a turning point. So we changed the name of the organization to the Coalition to Transform and began the process of looking at how the hospitals should in fact serve as anchors in the transformation, progressive transformation of the communities. And one of the key areas that we looked at was the supply chain. Found out that the supply chain of the healthcare sector between the public sector and the voluntary sector is $40 billion per year. This is for the purchase of toilet tissues, detergents, furniture, you name it. And then we found out that those contracts were being outsourced to right to work for less states. Then we found out that the corporation heads of those those corporations in those right to work for less states were actually writing checks to the so-called Freedom Caucus to undermine the Affordable Care Act. At this point, previous speaker, Dr. Phil Thompson, myself, Bruce Richards, and Maurice Reed, and others, presented this information to the governor. And it was at that point that the governor assembled a group, including Lee Pearlman from the Greater New York Hospital Association and Security, Inc., and said no more. That the resources that are in fact driven by our tax dollars between Medicare and Medicaid should in fact be redirected back into our local economy to address the structural economic inequality that in fact is causing many of the maladies that we see, the toxic triggers for poor health within our community, the social determinants of health, you know. In our community, folks are being stressed out, can't sleep, self-medicating because they can't achieve secure, affordable housing, among other things. So what we did, we began the process of looking at this in the context of how these hospitals should serve as anchor institutions, and have begun the process, and I'll talk about that a little later, I'm sure, begun the process of redirecting these resources to create new enterprises within our communities. But we're looking at enterprises that focus on, again, not only providing living wages for workers, but also broad-based profit sharing in the context of unionized worker cooperatives within the healthcare sector. So at this point in time, as a result of the work that has been achieved, we're looking at the co-creation of a unionized worker cooperative that will provide design and manufacturing for furniture for the healthcare sector, a urban farming system that would be organized, again, and informed by the concept of economic democracy that will provide produce for the healthcare sector. And I can go on in terms of some other initiatives. But the bottom line here was that, again, looking at the healthcare institutions as being central to the concept of the commons, and that these institutions should be reorganized so that, again, they address the structural economic inequality that exists within our communities, so that we will not continue to see children existing in a children's psychiatric hospital saying they want to stay there as opposed to going home to their neighborhoods. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, Roger. The first question that I wanted to ask is that as scholars and also activists, how are you engaged in practice based on your research and scholarship projects on the ground? You named a few, but wanted to give you an opportunity to do a deep dive in whichever project you choose. I would just say I was curious to learn more about the broadband network in Harlem. And Roger, I don't know if you want to give more of an example or go more in depth on one of the union co-ops that are being created.
Sure. So let me talk about 3 projects, one abroad and 2 here. I started this work with cities because I was called to Italy, not a bad place to go. City of Bologna. Okay, there we go. So I was called to this work with cities by a colleague who had been reading my work on urban commons and invited me to Italy, not a bad place to go. The city of Bologna was going to be a smart city and decided, after all, to be something else, and they wanted a framework. And what they did was they began to draft a regulation on the urban commons. And I helped them draft that regulation. And what that was that the city wanted to make sure that a lot of the public assets, and Bologna is a city that receives a lot of African immigrants and has a lot of neighborhoods of immigrants in which there's public housing and other assets. And what that regulation did, the way we drafted it, was to create what are called pacts of collaboration, in which the city allows a group of residents or community to take over or to manage some asset and revitalize it and use it for the community. And the city transfers its resources, not just the land or the building, to put in some legal form in which the community can manage it, and transfers is also technical as well as monetary resources. And Bologna, under that regulation, has signed over 300 pacts of collaboration around the city. In Harlem, I'm working with a number of other partners, including Silicon Harlem and others too. So New York City is a smart city, and you've seen the Link NYC on every corner in which you can catch free Wi-Fi. But yet, 1 in 3 households in Upper Manhattan and in the Bronx don't have access to broadband, high-speed services, which means that you have kids standing outside of Starbucks and public libraries trying to catch a signal to do their homework on their phone. So what we're doing there is in NYCHA housing and in public hospitals, we're working with engineers to put, and I won't go into the technology of it, but a disaggregated, affordable system, high-speed broadband system that will be co-managed by the community and civic actors. Very complicated project, but we got funding from the National Sciences Foundation under Smart and Connected Communities, and the framework is really the commons to make it a collectively governed, collectively owned, affordable resource in which it meets the community's needs, but also helps to bridge the digital divide. And the third example I'll mention is we're working with the city of Baton Rouge. Baton Rouge is a tale of two cities, one very wealthy and white, the other very African-American and poor. I mean, as in no car households, no street lights, a commercial corridor that's been hollowed out. And they've asked us to bring the co-city approach there, to bring institutional and legal tools as that community revitalizes to keep resources and to grow wealth within, and to make sure that it's kept in a collaborative or collective economy model through, again, land trusts, through community infrastructure, nonprofit corporations, through a lot of the tools that we have seen been used in cities all over the world. So I'll stop.
Oh, this one, I'm sorry. Either one? Yeah, okay, it works. Thank you, Paula. So I think in Brooklyn, particularly as part of the Interfaith Coalition going out of that, there are two things I'd like to emphasize. One is the importance of building a civic infrastructure that will support an economic democracy initiative. I'm sorry. One is creating a civic infrastructure that supports an economic democracy initiative, because I don't think you can do this unless you have the power of the community and organized labor behind it. You need union power and community power to move the agenda, to secure the policies both within the market as well as within the political economy to achieve our goals. And so with that, there has been an emphasis on building at each of the institutions what are called worker councils. In fact, on April 27th, we'll be assembling one of our first major meetings to address the issues of building community health and building community wealth in East New York and Brownsville through the work of workers at primarily at Brookdale Hospital, okay, but also attached to the larger community. So that's one. And then that power then should be leveraged to secure the type of new economic enterprises that we need within our communities. And so as a result of a research initiative that we did, participatory action research in Brownsville and East New York, there was a determination from the community that one of the key areas that they needed to address was food insecurity, and that in itself was creating poor health within Brownsville and East New York. We then took that thread and looked at that and said not only that we also needed to ensure that there was an emphasis on sustainable community economic development program. And so growing out of that was the creation of a new company called Brooklyn Sprout, which will be organized as a unionized worker cooperative with an agreement to grow produce through a hydroponic system that would be sold back to the healthcare sector. And that this food would be distributed to the hospitals, the ambulatory care facilities, and other nonprofits within the local economy. But it would be a job creation initiative as well, and an economic and an educational arm as well, providing educational opportunities in the study of biology, chemistry, and physics to students in the area who would then also receive a prepaid tuition trust fund from some of the proceeds of that coming out of that particular enterprise. So all of this grew out of really democratic practice, quite honestly. The research was participatory action research, which was informed by democratic practice, and then aligned currently with the worker councils that are being organized as we speak for a major meeting on April 27th in Brownsville at a public school in Brownsville with the support of both community and organized labor. The two major unions that have been supportive of this has been New York State Nurses Association and 1199 Health and Hospital Workers Union. Then the other most recent initiative, again, growing out of this reality that the healthcare sector was outsourcing dollars to right to work for less states. We took 14 elected officials with the help of MIT CoLab to Mondragon, Spain, to study the Mondragon Worker Cooperative in Spain. And coming out of that was a task force that looked at how the Mondragon mission might be applicable to two areas in New York City, the South Bronx and Central Brooklyn. So in Central Brooklyn right now, we have moved forward with we have a purchase order between a furniture manufacturing company called Ania and Mondragon to align with the minority business in Brooklyn to produce furniture for the healthcare sector. And so that's something that is in process, and we anticipate that that would be organized also as first a worker co-op, and then under national labor relations laws, eventually a unionized worker co-op. It has to be an enterprise first, and then you have to organize. So this is why the worker councils become important, because we're saying we're going to need a new model of organizing that we call not union organizing or new organizing, but what we call new union organizing, which is quite different, meaning collaboration between organized labor and the community to educate folks about the importance of unionized worker co-ops, and then releasing that social capital to create the power that we need to protect these enterprises once they're established.
In the interest of time, because we started a little bit late, but it was okay. Instead of me asking questions, there's plenty of brilliant people in this room. So we're going to open it up to questions from the audience.
Professor Foster, your idea of...
I'm sorry, sir, but if you could wait for the mic, just for those who may have hearing issues. Thank you.
Can I be heard? Professor Foster, your idea of the public commons, if I understand you right, sounds, at least superficially, a lot like a very old idea, which is that all public property is held by, it belongs to the people, is owned by the people, and simply held in trust by the government. Are there similarities or differences there? Because the ancient idea, which is sort of lost in the mists of history now, seems to be a very powerful one that's intimately involved with the strongest ideas we've inherited about democracy, and it has a lot of appeal and leverage, in particular from the standpoint of saying that while property rights are important, should be protected, can be enforced, they're not fundamental. They're always subordinate to the public interest.
So thank you for that question. It's a great question. So the public trust doctrine has ancient origins, but the way that it's been interpreted in the United States is to apply just to natural resources outside, so not to man-made resources. A lot of doctrines, a lot of the doctrine in the state courts when confronted in cases with whether city streets, alleys, land is protected by public trust, the answer is no. That at most in New York State, parkland is protected by public trust, and even then, the definition of a park is very narrow. So it wouldn't apply to any of the things that I've just talked about. And so the idea of the commons comes from the famous essay, The Tragedy of the Commons, right? And a lot of this is about resources that are are God-made, I should say, and that's a lot of what our laws protect as a public resource and trust. So what I'm doing is to bring to the city, right, these ideas that up to now, legally and frankly conceptually, have really been about things outside of places where we live, natural resources, parks, waters, et cetera. So these are very narrow doctrines. And for instance, when NYU was proposing to expand and to change Washington Square Park, there was a lawsuit brought on public trust grounds. I mean, if you look at all these cases, they're not winners because, again, this doctrine has been very narrowly interpreted. So yes, no, I mean, there's a new idea every 100 years, and so we're all improving on it, but I do think bringing the commons to the city and trying to figure out what that means practically and how we might apply it legally has really been my project, and it's really to fill in this hole that exists.
Hi. Cliff Rosenthal, Center for the Study of the Brooklyn and Cooperative Economics Alliance of New York City. Mr. Green, what I worry about as you talk, it's very difficult for startup cooperatives in particular to necessarily deliver the lowest price and so forth as a vendor. Are there any other, sort of legislative or rules or whatever that are going to make it harder to establish that direct supply link?
Well, I think one of the things that we are concerned about is if the worker cooperative movement is limited to like one-offs, I don't think we can, we'll see the type of transformation that we need. So what we are looking at is how do you aggregate a number of different unionized worker co-ops within a place-based and sector-based domain. Healthcare is the largest industry in the city and in the state. And so we think that that's where you begin as part of, a place-based and sector-based approach that essentially connects a number of previously disparate worker co-ops who would be providing the type of both services and supplies that are needed for the healthcare sector. And doing that within the context of an infrastructure that we are building called Citizens Share Brooklyn, which would be first a nonprofit that provides the type of technical assistance and coordination that would need it. We call for what we would call a Citizen Share Blueprint, to outline the type of economic strategies that would be needed for this initiative, and then also to aggregate the resources that we need to secure from impact investments from the private sector. I think that's going to be key. So we have met with a number of the leaders of the major hospitals who have agreed to create a nonprofit arm that would reach out to both the private sector, perhaps tapping into even the use of Community Reinvestment Act resources, also impact investments from the major foundations to help provide both investment capital and working capital for these entities. But again, if in fact I think, and we don't know this, but we're going to try, if we believe that currently we need an infrastructure wherein, like Mondragon, where various enterprises will be linked within a federation that's aligned with, again, a place-based and sector-based healthcare sector.
Say one more question.
Hi, I'm Alexander Kolokotronis. I'm a member of Unite here in New Haven, and in New Haven, recently there's been some news that there's gonna be a laundry cooperative started to sort of contract with the anchor institution, and so in that, my sort of question is, what precise role do you see for unions or in unionized worker co-op contexts? I imagine like the collective bargaining dimension of it is either secondary or maybe a part of it, but I'm wondering what's the precise role or vision you have for unions with worker co-ops?
I mean, I think that unions have played a myriad of roles, in including from the not so basic, but getting people into training that's been closed, OSHA training. Some of them have actually funded worker co-ops. And the union, in terms of speaking about Mondragon, in terms of speaking about the ecosystem and into cooperation, the union brings the solidarity piece that sometimes is missing in our work. The shift that Roger spoke about earlier is that sometimes it's hard to shift from an adversarial position to a more collaborative position. But I think more and more unions are actually, and especially with the leadership of 1199 and SEIU and the United Steelworkers, are on board with this model. And see it differently than the ESOP model, where I believe a lot of unions were screwed in the process, and trying to make sure that worker ownership is structured in a different way, where workers are actually the owners, and not just getting a living wage, but also asset accumulation that allows them to do so much more, right? In terms of our income, I know this sounds very basic, but I think sometimes we forget. Our income provides for our family, our income provides for our well-being, our income provides for our ability to go to the doctor, many things. So, and I think unions have the infrastructure, actually, that we could benefit from. Why recreate the wheel when they have done that? Now it needs to be tweaked, right? But unions definitely have a major role to play and more interested in it.
Okay, that will close out this plenary. So once again, thank you to our panel.